Hello, in this podcast we're looking at industrial meat and seafood production. We're not looking at the way we used to produce meat and seafood, we're looking at the way we do it today, the way we've industrialized it in the 20th and 21st centuries. In particular, we are going to be describing CAFOs and aquacultures and how they impact the environment, and also we're going to be explaining the tragedy of the commons and how that applies to seafood production. Here are pictures of CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations. Most of the animal food that we buy, here are pictures of turkeys and cows, most of the stuff that we buy, this is what they come from. They're not mom and pop operations that we imagine or what we have sort of pictured on the packages. If you buy something that's organic, then they may not be in this type of situation, but most of them are like this. These are also called feedlots, and they are large indoor-outdoor structures, and they're like that because they're designed for maximum output and efficiency. They're high-density farming. These farms have 2,500. They have as much as 2,500 pigs or 55,000 turkeys in one building. And while you didn't see it in those two pictures, frequently the animals can barely move, and this will minimize costs in land and feed. And these conditions are, of course, not natural to these animals, so they are frequently at risk to disease. And because of this, these animals are given antibiotics and nutritional supplements. And here are the environmental impacts of CAFOs. First thing is that the average CAFO produces as much manure as a town of 5,000 people. So that much manure can produce a significant problem to the rivers and lakes and streams. And because of that, the Clean Water Act will require the producers to have a permit to release wastewater into the surface water. However, sewage is rarely treated from the CAFOs. Farms do not have their own sewage treatment plants like cities and towns do. So what they typically do is they have land disposal. They will take the manure, they'll dry it, and they'll disperse it as fertilizer onto lands. Problem with that is that it will overload the soil with nutrients, and also it will sink into the ground, and it can very easily contaminate the groundwater. Also, it can be a source of food poisoning, because when there's a lot of rainfall, all that waste, which contains a lot of harmful bacteria like Salmonella bacteria, E. coli bacteria, that can wash into nearby fields, and that can cause problems like it did in 2006, where it washed into a spinach farm, and the people ended up eating that spinach. 4 people died, and 200 people ended up being very sick from E. coli food poisoning by eating contaminated spinach. Another problem with all of this is by using the antibiotics is all these bacteria end up being exposed to antibiotics, and that will expose them to selective pressure to become resistant to antibiotics. And it's one of the reasons why so many bacteria today are resistant to multiple types of antibiotics. And that can cause problems for us, is that many pathogens end up being resistant to multiple types of antibiotics, and that we can end up with things like tuberculosis bacteria, which we cannot. There is a solution to that. If you go to the supermarket or to the butcher, you have the option of buying animals that are free range, and these animals are not in feedlots. It avoids all these problems. One problem with that is that these animals are much more expensive. And I talk to any of these farmers, and any of these farmers say that they are completely willing to give up using feedlots, give up using these CAFOs, and switch to free range. Problem is that most people don't want to do that. They are not willing to spend the extra money to buy free range animals. Now we're going to move on to fisheries. So moving from eating stuff from the land to eating stuff from the ocean. A fishery is a commercially harvestable population of fish. When you come to fish, it's something that's different from animals. Like when you go to the supermarket and you buy chicken or you buy beef, you're buying a domesticated animal. when you buy fish, frequently you're actually buying something that's wild. Or sometimes you're buying something that's wild. We'll see. So here we're actually buying something that's taken out of the wild. That's what a fishery is. It's a wild population. We have fishermen that go out there and they catch the fish, or they catch the crabs, the lobster, the shrimp, whatever it is, and also fish in some coastal areas. That's their main source of animal protein. Now with fish, we end up with one problem that we don't have elsewhere. That fish don't stay within the borders of one country. They will move from one place to another. So that, if something stays within, say, the borders of the United States, then we can help keep that population viable by using laws. Now, if with the fish, that population can move outside of the waters of the United States, and once that happens, the laws of the United States, they don't apply anymore. They can move into international waters, and the laws of no country apply. What apply are treaties. Treaties apply between different countries, and then it only applies to the countries that have signed those treaties. So that's the difficulty in maintaining these fisheries, is that we have to have treaties between the countries that fish. So it's much more difficult to maintain these fisheries. For centuries, fisheries were maintained because it was difficult to locate these fish, and it was difficult to catch them, and it's difficult to store them on the ship. This, unfortunately, is no longer true. We can now catch many of them. Here we have diagrams that show how we can catch thousands of them by nets. And this first diagram here shows how whole schools of tuna are caught in nets. They're encircled by purse-seine fishing for tunas. And this bottom one here shows bottom trawling, where you have a huge net that just scrapes along the bottom of the ocean and scoops up thousands of fish along with it. And here briefly is how all these fish are caught. First, planes or sonar locate these schools, and then those nets, or also lines which contain hundreds or thousands of hooks, catch all these fish. And so that it's far more than what we were able to do back in, say, the 19th century. And now we come to the tragedy of the commons. And this applies to the fisheries. This was noted by Garrett Hardin in 1968. And he noted that a shared limited resource tends to become depleted because people act out of short-term self-interest. And without agreement or regulation, a common resource becomes depleted very quickly. The example that he used was a common pasture. And in England, an area that was a common was an area that was commonly used by everybody, and people would take their herds of sheep there to graze. And since it was commonly used by everybody, it wasn't in anybody's interest to maintain it, because if people weren't using it, other people could use it. So that when it comes to using the fish, if someone else holds back, someone else may not, and they'll make a profit, and the second person will make a larger profit, and the first person won't. There's really no incentive not to fish, not to get as much as you can. And because of that, fisheries have collapsed. And a study in 2006 showed that 30% of the fisheries had collapsed and showed a 90% decline. So today, people who are fishing are working harder than they did, and they're catching much fewer fish because there are fewer fish out there. So here are some solutions. They tried fishing seasons, but those didn't work because that just simply led to a race where during the fishing season people would fish as much as they could, no matter what the weather was, no matter what the hazards were. Catch limits didn't work. While it limited each boat to a maximum number of fish, there were no limits to how many permits were given. What has worked is something known as individual transferable quotas, or ITQ. And each fishery has a manager, and they set a total allowable catch. It is determined by what will allow a fishery to remain sustainable. And they distribute or sell quotas to fishers or fishing companies, and those with bigger catches will get bigger quotas. And quotas can be sold to other fishers or other fishing companies, and this is managed to produce sustainable fisheries. This only works in areas where countries control the waters. In international waters, this probably won't work unless there's an international treaty governing those areas. And if there's a fishery that will, say, span over a whole ocean, like, say, bluefin tuna, that type of thing may not work, especially when you have something like bluefin tuna where each fish can be sold for over $1,000. Another solution is aquaculture, or fish farms. If you go to the supermarket or you go to a fish market and you buy fish, some fish it'll say is wild, it'll say it's farmed. Like, for example, salmon, frequently it will tell you, it'll say that it's farmed or if it's wild. And frequently you'll see that the wild salmon is more expensive than the farmed. And basically, farmed fish, these are stocked seafood. We stock the seafood to protect them from disease and predators. And we actually have a fishery here in Long Island, and I visited just this past summer. And here's a video showing some of my visit to the fishery.
Okay, so here we are at the Cold Spring Harbor Fish Hatchery and Aquarium, and this is a small place for aquaculture. Aquaculture is where they raise fish for food, basically. And a lot of the fish here will be used to stock ponds and other places for people to be fishing, and also probably for food that you might get at the supermarket. The round pond you see over there is filled with trout, and there are a couple more trout fish. There are a couple more ponds over there for trout, and down the road over there, I'll show you some that are where you see the trout really close up. Here we see baby trout inside of a hatch house, and the hatch house protects them from hungry predators and sunlight, and they remain here about 4 months before they are moved to the rearing pools. This here is one of the rearing pools for the rainbow trout. You notice it's covered with a netting over here, and it's also covered with a netting on top. And this is to prevent any predators from eating any of the fish in there. And you look down in here, and you can see the fish. Let me find a... You can see them jumping around. And here's the water coming out, and this is well water. Here we have some of the younger fish. These fish here, as you see, they're just like in the other pond, they're very close together, so disease could be a problem. What they do here is all the water is not recycled. It comes out of the wells, so it's uncontaminated, and it goes from the youngest fish downstream to the oldest fish, and then goes straight into the Long Island Sound. So that means the chances of them actually getting a disease, especially since all the fish here are hatched at the fishery, there's really not too many fish coming from outside the hatchery, the chance of getting disease is very, very low. Other hatcheries, it might be a problem. What they generally use to treat it with is they might use chemicals at a low rate in order to prevent any disease coming through. But also sometimes they use antibiotics. Now here we have the brook trout inside of the rearing pond. You notice all the fish look alike, and there's a very good reason for that. They're all exactly the same kind of fish. And that's what you see in aquaculture. It's the same kind of fish. It's a monoculture, and there are advantages and disadvantages to this. one advantage is you've got the same kind of fish, and actually these are all the same age fish. They all hatched in December of 2010, which is about a year and a half ago. One big disadvantage would be with disease, that if one catches disease, it can easily spread. As you can see how close all these fish here are together, and you never see anything like this in the wild. Of course, a lot of fish here will bring us a lot of waste. And one of the main problems with aquaculture is that they produce lots of waste, because they're all going to the bathroom at the same time, and that can cause a lot of pollution. This particular hatchery is a small one, so they don't have to do anything to treat the waste. It just goes straight into the Long Island Sound. With bigger ones that are onshore like this one, they use the sewage treatment plant to treat the sewage. Other big ones that are offshore, they don't do anything to treat it. The current just washes the waste away and hopefully gets diluted. But you will find underneath the big fish pens, you will find dead zones where nothing lives because of all the sewage from the fish that have gone down there.
Now this picture here is an aquaculture for salmon, and this one, salmon is now because salmon is an ocean fish for much of its life, this one is in the ocean. And this one here produces a lot of waste. Unlike the ones that are inland, these don't get treated. If it produces a lot of waste, you just, like I said earlier, it just simply gets washed away by the currents, and hopefully it really does get diluted, and frequently it probably does not. But in aquaculture, we see that almost all of our trout, half our shrimp and half our salmon, are farmed. And the good thing about this is that it does relieve the pressures on the fisheries. And the negative is it produces waste, and also it produces disease because all these fish are put together unnaturally together, just as you saw in that. Now we come to our concluding questions. Number 1, what is a CAFO? Number 2, what is the impact of CAFOs on the environment? Number 3, why are so many fisheries collapsing? Number 4, how does aquaculture impact the environment? And that concludes this podcast, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.